Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this Game Industry Insight, a look behind the scenes at game development. And be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future video topics. Alright, for today's Industry Insight, I have an interesting topic that I want to talk about. And this is regarding post-release support, or knowing when to keep going or when to stop. And this is in response to a kind of a bit of news over at Battle Brothers or Overhyped Studios. As you know, we did talk to Jan of Overhyped twice over the last few months, right around the time the game was released. And when we were talking to him, he was talking about some of the plans that they were hoping to implement for Battle Brothers going forward. Specifically, having more detail or more variety in terms of maps, modding support, and a much requested feature, the Battle Sisters, or having female characters that you can recruit and train along with the men. And when we last spoke, I think that was, I want to say mid-April right now, he was talking about how they were hoping to do it, but they weren't sure if they were going to get around to it. And it was announced this week that they are sadly not doing it. Now, Battle Brothers, if you don't know, is a gritty or a real down-to-earth fantasy game where you run a mercenary company in a fantasy take on the medieval period. There are goblins, trolls, zombies, and all that, but it's still kept very much in the realm of axes and pikes rather than magic spells and dragons. And the game is done. It was released again a few months ago, 1.0. It went through the whole Kickstarter, I think, to early access period. But with the game being finished and with them deciding to move on, it's got a lot of people angry at them. And I want to share my thoughts on this because, again, one of the things that I've realized with doing Game Wisdom is that I'm kind of in that middle ground between an enthusiast and a developer, having spent so much time talking to developers over the last few years. And this really raises the question on entitlement when it comes to these kinds of designs. As we've talked about many times over, Kickstarter and crowdfunding and even early access has really given the layer of transparency or lowered it for a lot of game designers and for people interested in learning games. It's not like the old days when at the most you'll learn about a game could be like a 4 to 5 page feature in a magazine. With many games on early access, you are basically on the front lines of watching a game grow from prototype to alpha to beta to full retail. And that really affords a lot of that behind the scenes look at game development. But with that said, it still doesn't really give the full picture of what it means to design a game, especially when it comes to the planning and financial side. When I spoke with Jan about Battle Brothers a few months ago, he talked about how they had to be really careful with managing expectations with what they could feasibly do. And as we've talked about with the topic of feature creep, there's always that allure to just keep adding stuff. Someone suggests, why don't you add 2 more levels? Let's add 2 more levels. What about random costumes and custom soundtracks and everything like that? And it's very easy for a lot of people to view video games as a whole. If game A has multiplayer, why doesn't yours? If there's 2 different roguelikes, one features procedurally generated levels, the other features randomly, why can't you make a procedurally generated engine? And this becomes all the more conflated when we talk about post-release support. As we've said, games as a service and long-term development is becoming or has become a major strategy for everyone involved. For a lot of games, it's no longer about working on a title for 2 to 3 years, releasing it, and then moving on to the next. It's you work on that game, you release it, and then if it's popular, you keep supporting it for as long as you can. As we've talked about with Payday 2, this has been a very successful model for them, with the game I think now being about 3 years old, and they still have more development to do. And again, Payday 2 and games like it are fundamentally different after this whole process than they were at launch. And the difference between the development and what ends up happening is huge. And this is why a lot of people like post-release support, because it allows them to enjoy their games even longer and maybe give a chance to add more stuff to make it better, as we've seen with the case with the recent announcement of the XCOM 2 expansion. But there's definitely that sense of entitlement that is very dangerous when it comes to taking developer promises as developer fact. As we've said many times before, game development is not an exact science. And anyone who says that they know exactly how their game's going to turn out from beginning, middle to end is a damn liar. Things change. Maybe your brilliant idea doesn't work. Maybe your idea is going to cost more than you actually have money for in the budget. And there's always that risk versus reward of what to add into your game. And when I spoke to Jan, we did talk about this in terms of the constraints they had with how they designed the game, programmed the engine, and simply with coming up with the assets. For those of you who don't know, Battle Brothers features units that are basically like little tokens on a map. They don't have any feet. And while that may look like a stylistic choice, Jan told me that it was very much a financial point of view. To fully render these characters and get the animation will have taken them over their budget. And again, talking about game budgets and profit is easily another topic in of itself. There are people out there who think that if your game sold 5 million copies, then you're millionaires. But as we know, development and the amount of cost or the overhead can easily eat into all that lovely profit. But getting back to Battle Brothers, their forums are full of people who have been complaining about this, saying that the developers are just cutting and running. They've lied to us. And honestly, I don't find that fair. Again, Battle Brothers is done. It hit 1.0. It survived the entire early access process. And the game is good. Is it the greatest strategy game or roguelike of all time? No. But to have this as your first game really speaks volumes about what they were able to achieve. And to expect them to keep working on this game and adding in all that content kind of sounds like a fool's errand. Because as we've said, you have to be able to balance what you want to do with what you can do. And while Battle Brothers was a successful game, it's obviously nowhere near the same level as stuff like Stardew Valley and Darkest Dungeon and so on. And that's the other side of the coin. Just because you've promised the stuff doesn't mean that there is a market or an audience for it. You can have people in your forum say, well, I'll pay for mining support or I'll pay for so-and-so. But is that really going to equal the amount of cost that's going to go into it? And we have seen cases where developers will just keep working on a game and there may not be a market for it. When I spoke with Chris Park from Arkin Games, he talked about how one of the changes they made in terms of developing their titles was to take a wait-and-see approach to DLC. Just because 20 people say they're going to buy your DLC doesn't mean that doesn't mean that you should just immediately develop your game's DLC, especially if your game is just barely breaking even to begin with. Now, if you have a game like Darkest Dungeon or the success of Payday 2, then adding more content to that is a given. If your game is a horrible failure, then it's easy to say, well, I'm not going to keep supporting it. Why would I keep supporting something that's dead? But what happens when your game is just okay or just good? And that's where this risk comes into play. Because something like Battle Brothers, and I can see this from the other side, you have this game that has gone through the entire cycle, or entire development cycle, people like it, so why shouldn't you keep developing it? Why shouldn't you double down? And this is incredibly important when it comes to brand recognition. If your first game is a good title, then shouldn't you want to keep pushing it? Again, going back to the Darkest Dungeon example, Red Hook really did knock it out of the park with that game with the teaser art, the trailer footage, Wayne June just talking for everybody there. And it was a no-brainer to keep supporting it. But when you don't have that enormous success, how do you know if your game is worth it to put DLC out for? Because you could spend, again, if we were in Magic Perfect Land, you could spend a year, 2 years, 3 years or more on more DLC. But what happens if no one's buying that and you've committed to that cycle? That can easily sink a studio if you're spending the next 2 to 3 years of your life on stuff that most people aren't going to play. And like I said, the other side of things and what the critics say is that, well, if you want more interest in your game, you should develop more DLC, because more DLC will give more interest, which will give more marketability, so more people will buy it. But again, that is entirely up in the air, and you never know what's going to happen like that. And one thing that kind of really started to annoy me were there were a few forum people who said that something along the lines of, well, I like your game, I thought it was great, but because you're not making any more content, I'm not going to buy any more of your games. I'm going to tell my friends not to trust you anymore. And that stuff is just horrible. If you enjoy a game and want to see developers make more, you don't tell them that, you don't issue an ultimatum and say that I'm going to tell people not to buy your game anymore. That really defeats the purpose, and I hate to say, really shows a dangerous level of entitlement by consumers when it comes to game development. And like we said when we talked about Kickstarter, those kinds of stretch goals, or having stretch goals in particular, are a double-edged sword. Because if something doesn't work and you've promised it, how do you go back on that without infuriating a lot of people? And even if it's a game that succeeded, what if you originally promised multiplayer? I don't know if Battle Brothers did, but I know Clockwork Empires did. And what if it just doesn't work? How do you know when it's time to pull that cord or hit the ejector seat on a game? And again, this is something that it's not an easy question to answer, and especially from me. For those of you watching this who are developers, have you ran into situations where you had to cut a promised feature or make that tough decision between, do I keep supporting this game or do I let it go and try to work on something else? Because again, the other side of the coin is, will your next idea come anywhere near, or I'm sorry, will it come anywhere near as successful as your first one? And again, there's just so much that's up in the air about game development that's hard to tell. And some developers try to make right by their customers by saying, the game didn't work, but I promised X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to keep working on it. And while that certainly is admirable, it also puts you in a very risky position. Because like I said, that DLC could save your game, it could raise itself up notoriety-wise, or you could spend the next 6 to 12 months on content that will never make back what you put into it. And again, there's no easy answer to this. If you're hoping for me to give you the sage or Zen-like advice of what to do in this situation, I don't have it. So, with that said, we're going to wrap up today's industry insight here because there is no easy answer to it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, but otherwise, if you are new, be sure to like and subscribe, and check back for daily discussions on game design here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. So, until our next vlog, have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings, as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GWBycer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.